Okay, let's unpack this. What makes a society truly fair? I mean, what does it actually mean for something to be just?
Right. These aren't just, abstract philosophical puzzles.
Not at all. They get right to the heart of how we live together, how resources get shared out, who gets a voice. It's really fundamental.
It's this basic human quest, isn't it? This search for fairness, for justice. And it's something people have been debating and rethinking for literally centuries.
Absolutely. And what's striking is how this ancient question, it's still maybe the single biggest issue in modern political thought.
It really is. But the moment you try to pin down what is justice, well, you find out pretty quickly there's no easy single answer.
No, it just opens up this huge range of different viewpoints.
An incredible diversity of perspectives, yeah.
And that's exactly what this deep dive is all about today. We've got some really fascinating source material here that walks us through some of the major ways thinkers have tackled justice. It really shows you just how complex the whole conversation is.
It does. And the sources, they introduce these perspectives you hear all the time, really, in public debates about, say, policy or the economy or social issues.
Ideas rooted in these big traditions.
Exactly. Liberal, libertarian, Marxist, democratic socialist, anarchist, feminist, subaltern, and communitarian views. It covers a lot of ground.
Wow, yeah, that's quite a list. A real landscape of ideas.
So our mission today, digging into this material, is basically to pull out the key ideas from each one.
We want to get a grip on their main arguments, what they see as the core demands of justice, and, importantly, how they push back against each other.
Think of it as kind of a shortcut, maybe. A way for you to get up to speed on the foundational debates that really shape how we think about fairness, rights, how society ought to work.
Giving you that framework to see why people disagree so fiercely about what a just society actually looks like.
Yeah, we'll be exploring how these different philosophies handle that crucial problem of, well, how do you distribute the primary goods of life?
And that's not just money and stuff, right?
No, not at all. It's the fundamental things. Rights, liberties, opportunities, power, even the conditions you need for self-respect. Understanding these different approaches is really powerful because, well, they influence everything, our laws, how we see fairness day to day.
Okay, let's jump right in then.
So the source material makes it clear right away. This quest for justice, it's ancient, but it's still incredibly urgent.
Still a core problem in political theory.
Exactly. And it stays a core problem precisely because it's so complex. The fact that we have all these different schools of thought, liberal, libertarian, Marxist, and the rest, that's not just academic navel-gazing.
No, it shows how genuinely hard it is to define fairness, let alone achieve it, when you're juggling different values, different experiences.
It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all deal. Each perspective we're going to look at is coming at the problem of injustice from a slightly different angle, prioritizing different things.
Which naturally leads them to propose pretty different ways of organizing society.
Okay, so let's start with a big one, a real touchstone in modern thinking about justice. The liberal perspective, especially as John Rawls laid it out.
Rawls. Right, a theory of justice.
Yeah, the source highlights that this view really puts liberty front and center. But, and this is crucial, it tries to weave in equality and even a sense of, well, community or fraternity within that framework that prioritizes freedom.
His book, A Theory of Justice from '71, that really did reshape the whole conversation, didn't it?
Absolutely. He argues that justice, maybe it isn't the only good thing a society needs, but it's definitely the first thing, the first virtue.
Meaning a society could be, say, really efficient or stable, but if it's fundamentally unjust.
That it's morally flawed. It risks falling apart in a way.
Yeah.
His main focus is this problem of distribution. How do we share things out fairly?
Right. For Rawls, a just society is one that manages to distribute what he calls primary goods in a just way.
And these primary goods are the things that, well, rational people would want no matter what else they want in life, because you need them to pursue pretty much any goal.
The sources list them. Basic rights and liberties.
Powers, opportunities, income, wealth.
And critically, the social bases of self-respect. It's not just about the material stuff.
No, it's about the fundamental conditions for living a decent life, pursuing your own path.
And he brings in this idea of pure procedural justice. Sounds a bit technical.
It does, but the basic idea is pretty straightforward. If the rules or principles everyone agrees on for distributing these goods are fair.
Like the process itself is fair.
Exactly. If the process is fair, then whatever outcome results from applying those rules is automatically considered just. You focus on setting up fair procedures, not aiming for a specific, predetermined distribution.
Okay, I see. And he develops this partly by pushing back hard against utilitarianism.
Yeah, that's a major point. The source notes that utilitarianism is all about maximizing overall happiness, right? The greatest happiness for the greatest number.
But Rawls says, hang on, that can lead to some really terrible outcomes.
Totally. The classic example the source mentions is pretty stark. What if, hypothetically, enslaving a small minority somehow made everyone else much, much happier overall?
A strict utilitarian calculation might actually say that's okay.
But Rawls says absolutely not. Never. You cannot violate fundamental individual liberties or inflict that kind of suffering, no matter how much it might increase the total happiness of others.
Individual rights come first. Fairness trumps just adding up happiness points.
Exactly. Individual dignity matters more than collective utility in that sense. So to figure out what fair principles people would agree on, he uses this really clever thought experiment. It builds on that old social contract idea.
This is the original position idea.
That's the one. Imagine people getting together to decide the basic rules of their society, but before they know anything specific about themselves or where they'll end up in that society.
And they're behind a veil of ignorance. That's the key bit.
Crucial. Behind this veil, they don't know their race, their gender, their social class, what natural talents they have, whether they'll be rich or poor, healthy or sick. They don't even know their own specific values or life goals.
Wow. So they're stripped of all the things that usually bias our judgments.
That's the idea. What they do know, according to the sources, is general stuff about how society works, basic economics, psychology, and importantly, they have a sense of justice. They want fair terms of cooperation.
And they're self-interested, wanting those primary goods for themselves.
Right, but not envious of others. And the source mentions a key assumption. They're risk-averse. They want to play it safe.
Ah, okay. So because they're risk-averse and they have absolutely no idea where they'll land in society.
Rawls argues they'd choose principles that would protect them even if they ended up in the worst possible position. It's like you have to choose the rules not knowing if you'll be king or peasant, so you make sure the peasant gets a decent deal.
They'd put themselves in the shoes of the least advantaged, basically.
And demand principles that make that minimum position as good as it can possibly be. Maximize the minimum outcome, the maximum rule.
And this whole thought process leads them, in Rawls's view, to agree on 3 specific principles of justice. And they come in a strict order.
Yes, a strict lexical order.
Yeah.
The first principle always comes first.
Which is?
The principle of equal basic liberties. Everyone has an equal claim to the most extensive set of basic liberties that's compatible with everyone else having the same set.
And these are the really fundamental ones.
Yeah, political liberties, voting, holding office, freedom of speech, assembly, thought, conscience, freedom of the person, protection from violence, psychological harm, right to hold personal property, freedom from arbitrary arrest, the basics.
And the source stresses you can't trade these away. Not for economic gain, not for anything else. Liberty comes first.
Priority of liberty, exactly. Then comes the second principle, which actually has 2 parts. The first part is fair equality of opportunity. Social and economic inequalities, differences in wealth, power, status, must be attached to positions and offices that are open to everyone under conditions of fair equality of opportunity.
So not just formally open like anyone can apply, but genuinely fair.
Right. It means people with similar talents and motivation should have roughly similar life chances, regardless of the social class they were born into. Requires actively trying to mitigate the effects of background circumstances on opportunity.
Okay, for equality of opportunity. What's the second part of the second principle?
That's the really famous one, the difference principle. This says that those same social and economic inequalities are only justified if they work out to be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society.
Whoa. So inequality is okay only if it makes the worst off group better off than they would be under perfect equality.
Precisely. If an unequal distribution of income, say, ends up boosting the prospects of the very poorest more than an equal distribution would, then that specific inequality is permissible.
The source gives an example, right? Like paying doctors more.
Yeah, rewarding someone with special skills or who puts in extra effort might be justified, but only if having that reward system in place ultimately benefits the least privileged the most. Maybe higher doctor salaries mean better healthcare access for the poor, for instance.
So efficiency, like getting the most out of the economy, that's important, but it has to happen within these rules.
It's constrained. Liberty first, then fair opportunity, then you arrange inequalities to maximize the minimum position. Only after those are met does pure efficiency come into play.
Rawls also mentions something called the chain connection.
Right. He suggests that if the difference principle is working properly, improving the situation of the least advantaged tends to pull everyone else up too, or at least not make them worse off. Like strengthening the weakest link helps the whole chain. Benefits for the better off should ideally ripple down and raise expectations for everyone, especially the worst off.
Because of this focus on the least advantaged, Rawls often gets pegged as supporting a redistributive state, right? A welfare state.
Definitely. The source mentions Samuel Gorovitz, arguing that Rawls essentially sees government's job as including achieving distributive justice, specifically by prioritizing the needs of the neediest group.
It's a really compelling framework, powerful stuff, but like any big idea, it's got its critics.
Oh, absolutely. The source outlines several major lines of criticism.
For instance, collectivists.
They tend to argue that, despite all the focus on the least advantaged, Rawls' theory basically ends up justifying capitalism. They feel it allows huge inequalities as long as the poor get some small benefit, which kind of excuses the fundamental problems of private property and market systems.
And then there's the practical issue. Who exactly are the most disadvantaged?
Good question. Is it just about money? What about people disadvantaged by, say, disability or poor health or lack of natural talent, or even things like emotional insecurity? The source raises this: how do you measure and compare these different kinds of disadvantage within Rawls' system if it's not just about income?
And Marxists have a different take altogether.
Fundamentally different. They criticize the whole methodology. This idea of choosing principles behind a veil of ignorance, totally detached from real-world power structures, class relations, property ownership. They see it as an empty abstraction. It ignores the actual material conditions that cause injustice in their view.
Then you've got the libertarians coming from the other direction.
Right. They argue Rawls sacrifices too much individual liberty for the sake of equality. Why should the talented or hardworking be essentially forced, through taxes and redistribution, to work for the benefit of the least advantaged?
They see it as undermining freedom and maybe even hindering progress, because that risk-averse choice behind the veil wouldn't encourage the kind of innovation that drives society forward.
And finally, the communitarians. They criticize what they see as Rawls' ethical neutrality.
Meaning he avoids defining a specific good life.
Exactly. Communitarians argue that by trying to be neutral about what constitutes a good life or a common good for the community, Rawls' theory misses something important about justice. The idea that it might involve pursuing shared values and participating together in building a good society.
Okay, so lots of criticism, but the source also pushes back on those critiques a bit.
It does offer a counterappraisal. It suggests some critiques might be a bit one-sided, maybe not fully capturing the complexity of Rawls' position.
How so?
Well, it argues Rawls' theory is actually quite sophisticated, pulling together different threads. It has libertarian elements, the self-interest in the original position, the absolute priority of basic liberties.
But it's also strongly egalitarian.
Very. Equal liberty, fair, equal opportunity, and especially that difference principle demanding inequalities benefit the least advantaged. That's a powerful egalitarian thrust.
And the chain connection idea.
That resonates a bit with communitarian concerns, doesn't it? The idea that strengthening the weakest parts benefits the whole social fabric.
So the source kind of suggests Rawls is building this complex model.
Yeah, trying to synthesize these different values.
Yeah.
The takeaway seems to be that while Rawls' framework could operate within a capitalist system, if his principles were genuinely applied, that system would have to look a lot more humane, as the source puts it.
Because of that strong focus on basic liberties and the well-being of the worst off, he's trying to make fair procedures serve the goals of social justice.
Okay, now let's shift from Rawls' specific brand of liberalism to the libertarian perspective, which is most famously championed by Robert Nozick.
Nozick, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, another huge influence.
Definitely. And like Rawls, liberty is absolutely central, but oh boy, the way he interprets it and the conclusions he draws are worlds apart.
How so? What's the main difference?
Nozick focuses on what you might call formal liberty, individual rights, especially property rights, and argues for a drastically minimal state, a night watchman state.
Unlike Rawls, who seems to allow for a state that redistributes wealth to help the least advantaged.
Exactly. Nozick is fiercely opposed to that. He sees the welfare state as fundamentally unjust. The source calls him a right liberal or pure libertarian, advocating laissez-faire capitalism, contrasting him with Rawls as the left liberal supporting redistribution.
So his book is really a counter-argument to Rawls.
Very much so. He directly critiques Rawls's whole approach to distributive justice. Nozick finds the idea of distributing primary goods decided in an original position totally unrealistic. It's like these goods just magically appeared, ready to be handed out.
Like manna from heaven, the source says.
Yeah. For Nozick, justice isn't about achieving some ideal pattern of distribution like Rawls' difference principle aims for. It's all about history. How did the current distribution come about? Did it arise through just steps?
It's about entitlement. Are people entitled to what they currently have?
Precisely. How were things originally acquired, and how were they transferred? If those steps were just, the resulting distribution is just, no matter how unequal it looks.
Okay, so he lays out principles for this. Principles of entitlement.
3 main ones. The first deals with getting hold of things that weren't previously owned, especially stuff from the natural world, land, resources.
Justice in initial acquisition. How does something unowned become legitimately owned?
Nozick leans on John Locke here, loosely. He suggests an acquisition is just if it doesn't make anyone else worse off than they were when the thing was unowned.
The Lockean proviso leaving enough and is good for others.
Right, but the source immediately points out a problem. In a world with finite resources, that condition is incredibly hard, maybe impossible to actually meet. How much land or oil can you take before others are arguably worse off? It makes justifying current property holdings based purely on just initial acquisition pretty tricky.
Okay, so that's the first principle. What's the second?
Justice and transfer. This covers everything that happens after things are initially owned. It applies to transferring property you already justly hold or transferring things you create using your own labor, talent, or ingenuity.
So buying and selling, gifts, inheritance.
As long as it's voluntary. If someone justly owns something and voluntarily transfers it to someone else through a sale, a gift, whatever, then the person receiving it becomes justly entitled to it. The key is voluntary contract, no force, no fraud.
And this connects to a moral idea.
Yes, the Kantian idea again.
Right.
Treat people as ends in themselves, not just means. Taking someone's property or the fruits of their labor without their consent violates their rights, treats them as a means.
So even a slavery contract would be invalid.
Absolutely. It wouldn't be truly voluntary in the right sense. The famous Wilt Chamberlain example the source uses illustrates this well.
Ah, yes, the basketball player.
If millions of people freely choose to pay a small amount to watch him play, and he becomes incredibly wealthy as a result, Nozick says that wealth is justly acquired. It came from countless voluntary transfers.
Same for an inventor charging a lot for a cure.
Yes, as long as they aren't, say, cornering the market on the only available water source everyone needs to survive, if it's a product of their ingenuity, people choosing to pay for it makes the resulting wealth just.
Okay, initial acquisition, voluntary transfer. What's the third principle?
Justice in rectification. Yeah. This is the only place Nozick sees a role for the state beyond basic protection like police and courts.
Rectification of past wrongs.
Exactly. The state can intervene, justly, only to correct past violations of the first 2 principles. So, if property was initially acquired unjustly, violating the worse-off rule maybe, or transferred involuntarily, theft, fraud, coercion, then the state has grounds to step in and try to fix it.
But if inequalities just arise from a long series of purely voluntary trades and gifts between justly entitled people,
then those inequalities, however large, are not unjust in Nozick's view, and there's no justification for the state to intervene through redistribution.
wow, that leads to a very, very limited state.
The minimal state, or night watchman state. Its only job is protecting people from force, theft, fraud, and enforcing contracts. That's it.
So things like welfare programs, public education funded by taxes, Social Security.
All illegitimate uses of state power, according to Nozick. Why? Because they require taxation.
And taxation is the problem.
For Nozick, taxation for anything beyond funding the minimal state is fundamentally unjust. He famously compares it to forced labor.
Forced labor, how does he make that leap?
His argument is that taking a portion of someone's earnings through taxes is like claiming ownership over a portion of their labor time. You're forcing them to work, say, X number of hours for the state's purposes, like funding welfare, purposes they might not have voluntarily chosen.
So it treats the taxpayer as a means to other people's ends, violating that core principle.
That's the claim. Helping the poor, in his view, should be purely a matter of private charity, freely chosen by individuals, not something enforced by the state as a matter of justice.
Okay, that's a stark view. And predictably, it draws a lot of fire.
Oh, yes. The source lays out several major criticisms. Many argue his view is inherently biased towards the wealthy and powerful. Well, critics say it essentially blesses the outcomes of a competitive market system that naturally favors those who start with advantages. More resources, better connections, maybe just luck. It potentially leaves the less fortunate behind with no safety net and absolves the rich of any broader social responsibility for how their wealth was generated or its impact.
Some argue it can even justify existing oppression.
If those oppressive structures arose through formally voluntary means, or if the original injustice is too far back to realistically rectify, then yes, the framework could be seen as locking in historical disadvantage.
And the rectification principle itself gets questioned.
Yeah, some critics see it as selectively applied. Maybe it's used to question the legitimacy of, say, oil wealth based on control of a natural resource, but less effective at questioning fortunes built through exploiting labor or market manipulation that occurred within a technically voluntary system.
And the whole idea of relying on charity.
That's a huge point of contention. Critics argue it completely ignores how market operations themselves, even if based on individual voluntary exchanges, can systematically create poverty, disadvantage, and injustice for whole groups of people. Making their well-being dependent on the whims of charity seems inadequate.
The source draws a direct contrast here with Rawls.
Right. Rawls's whole system is built around concern for the least advantaged. Critics argue that that fundamental concern for substantive justice is just missing from Nozick's focus on procedural entitlement.
Okay, let's shift gears dramatically now. The Marxist perspective. This one's complex, partly because, as the source points out, there's even a debate about whether justice is the right word to use within Marxism.
It does seem a bit odd at first, doesn't it, given how much Marxism talks about inequality and exploitation.
You'd think justice would be central.
But some interpretations argue that classical Marxism isn't really about achieving justice within capitalism. It's about understanding the historical forces of class struggle and revolution that will ultimately overthrow capitalism and lead to a completely different system.
So trying to fix capitalism's injustices is missing the point.
That's the argument. Exploitation isn't just a flaw in the system, it is the system. You can't make an inherently exploitative system just. Marx himself, the source reminds us, criticized socialists who focused only on getting a fairer distribution under capitalism. He saw that as tinkering, not transforming.
And there's the idea of justice being part of the superstructure.
Right. The Marxist view often sees morality, law, justice. These are part of the ideological superstructure that grows out of and reflects the economic base, the mode of production. So what counts as just changes depending on whether you're in feudalism, capitalism, or communism.
And in the final communist stage, with no scarcity or class conflict,
The state, courts, the whole apparatus of justice would become unnecessary and just, wither away.
But the source also says there are strong reasons to think Marx was deeply concerned with justice.
Oh, absolutely. Even if his political goal wasn't reform, his analysis is dripping with moral outrage.
He called exploitation theft, robbery. That's pretty clear moral language.
Definitely. And he didn't just critique capitalism, he proposed a principle for distribution in communist society. From each according to his ability to each according to his need. That is undeniably a principle of distributive justice, one he clearly saw as morally superior to capitalism's logic.
Plus, his whole critique of capitalism is an attack on the power dynamics, the dominance and dependence in the wage-labor relationship. You can easily read that as a critique of profound social injustice.
So while the solution is revolution, not reform, it's hard to deny that the motivation comes from a deep sense of the injustice of exploitation.
Which brings us to that core Marxist concept, surplus value. How does Marx see exploitation actually working?
Okay, so according to Marx, the value of any product ultimately comes from the labor that went into making it. Land, machinery, raw materials, they contribute value, but only labor adds new value. It's the active, creative element.
Value is embodied labor time, essentially.
The socially necessary labor time, on average. The market price might fluctuate around this value based on supply and demand, but the underlying value comes from labor. Now here's the key. Workers don't sell their finished product. They sell their labor power to the capitalists, their ability to work for a set period.
And how is the price of that labor power, the wage, determined?
By the cost of keeping the worker alive and able to work, and to raise the next generation of workers. Basically a subsistence wage, just enough for food, shelter, essentials.
But in a working day, a worker can produce more value than just the value of their own subsistence.
Exactly. Let's say it takes 3 hours of work to produce value equivalent to the worker's daily wage. But the capitalist has bought their labor power for, say, 8 hours.
So the worker works for 8 hours, gets paid for 3 hours worth of value.
And the value created in those extra 5 hours. That's the surplus value.
Uh-huh. And where does that surplus value go?
It's appropriated by the capitalist. It's the source of their profit. Rent and interest are also seen as portions of this surplus value. The worker creates all the new value, but only gets paid for the part that covers their subsistence. The rest, the unpaid labor, is the exploitation.
So the Marxist solution is to get rid of this relationship.
Fundamentally, overthrow capitalism, abolish private ownership of the means of production, factories, land, etc., and socialize them. Then there's no private capitalist extracting surplus value.
The value created goes back to the worker or to collective services.
That's the idea. The principle shifts. No longer exploitation, but maybe something like, he who does not work, neither shall he eat.
What does the envisioned socialist society look like after the revolution?
Well, there's a transition phase. Key industries are taken into social ownership. Production becomes more cooperative.
And the state, it doesn't disappear immediately.
No, in this transition, the state is actually crucial. It's seen as the dictatorship of the proletariat.
It sounds pretty harsh.
It does to modern ears. But the source explains it wasn't necessarily meant as tyranny in the way we think of it now. It meant the working class holding political power to suppress resistance from the old ruling class and to dismantle capitalist structures and values. It's seen as a temporary, necessary step.
Before the state eventually withers away in full communism.
Oh, right. Once class antagonisms disappear, the need for a state, as an instrument of class rule, disappears too.
What are the main jobs of this transitional socialist state, according to thinkers like Lenin?
Well, first, the actual socialization of production and distribution, abolishing private ownership of major assets, land, banks, factories often without compensation, and the state stepping in to organize large-scale production and planning.
And a big focus on boosting production.
Huge focus. Lenin saw raising productivity through centralized planning as absolutely fundamental after taking power. Getting the economy working for the masses, developing science and technology was seen as vital for this.
Mao Zedong added another dimension, didn't he? Culture.
Yes, Mao emphasized the need to transform bourgeois culture. He argued the class struggle doesn't just end when you change the economic system. It continues in the realms of politics, ideology, culture. Old habits and values run deep.
So you need a conscious effort to build a new socialist culture, a kind of permanent revolution on the cultural front.
That was his idea, yes. He even argued the superstructure, culture, ideology, could sometimes dominate the economic base.
And what about the international side?
Classical Marxism was internationalist, workers of the world, unite. Lenin later focused more on socialism in one country. After World War II, neo-Marxists often saw the struggle shifting, with socialist states needing to support liberation movements in developing nations against imperialism and neocolonialism. The class struggle goes global between nations.
So, if you had to boil down the Marxist vision of justice.
The Communist Manifesto famously summed it up: the abolition of private property.
But the source makes an important distinction here.
Crucial distinction. It's about abolishing private property in the sense of the means of production owned by a few who exploit others. It's not about abolishing personal property, your clothes, your house, the tools you use for your own work. Marxism, the source argues, would actually protect that kind of personal property derived from one's own labor.
The goal is to end class divisions, end exploitation.
Leading to a society where the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Political power, seen as one class oppressing another, would lose its meaning.
But the source ends this section with a critical note.
Yes, a very important one. It questions the core assumption that private property is the only root of class distinctions and injustice. Meaning, even if you abolish private ownership of factories and land, can't new forms of inequality and domination emerge? Based on who holds political power, who controls the bureaucracy, access to information. The source suggests that history shows class distinctions and injustice can reappear even without private property in the traditional sense. The problem might be more complex.
Right. Okay, that sets us up nicely to talk about democratic socialism. They share some goals with Marxism, but take a very different path.
Absolutely. The method is key. Democratic socialists aim for socialist goals reducing inequality, taming capitalism, but through evolutionary democratic means. Elections, legislation, gradual reform, not violent revolution.
The core idea is that democracy and socialism aren't enemies, they're allies.
Exactly. They see both as fundamentally about empowering ordinary people and improving their lives. So use democratic tools, parliaments, free speech, parties to achieve socialist objectives. It's a modification of classical Marxism in many ways.
What are some of the key differences or tenets?
Well, one is partial socialization. Not necessarily taking over the entire economy, but state ownership or strong public control over essential sectors, utilities, transport, finance, maybe to ensure basic goods and services for everyone. Private enterprise might still exist elsewhere.
And they focus on more than just material needs.
Yes, very much so. The source emphasizes satisfying moral, intellectual, emotional needs, too. So robust public funding for education, arts, culture, healthcare, aiming for the full development of the human personality, not just filling bellies.
And democratic freedoms are non-negotiable.
Absolutely essential. Freedom of thought, speech, religion, movement, these are seen as vital for individual development and a healthy society, regardless of the economic system. You don't sacrifice freedom for equality.
Which means they reject the dictatorship of the proletariat idea completely.
Fundamentally, any form of dictatorship is seen as oppressive, suppressing personality, and ultimately undermining the goal of human happiness.
So they need real democracy, competing parties, opposition.
Yes. Free competition for power, effective opposition, strong civil society groups. These aren't just nice-to-haves. They're seen as necessary checks and balances to ensure socialist policies actually serve the people and don't become authoritarian.
The source mentions thinkers like Harold Lasky,
Who tried to blend liberal freedoms with socialist economic justice, yes, and E.F.M. Durbin. And often, the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, are held up as examples of societies trying to achieve this balance. India, too, the source notes, has claimed this path.
It sounds like a challenging combination to pull off.
Extremely challenging. The source concludes it's an ambitious goal, trying to secure both traditional democratic rights and civil liberties, plus extensive socioeconomic rights, like healthcare, education, housing. It's presented as maybe the ideal path to social justice, but a very difficult one.
What makes it so difficult? What does success depend on?
Two main things, according to the source. First, you need really strong, sustained public support for socialist principles, enough to consistently elect governments truly committed to implementing them. You need the political will.
And second,
You need the money. A strong enough economic base to actually fund all those public services and social security programs without resorting to coercion or imposing taxes so high that they kill economic dynamism.
the incentive problem again.
Exactly. It requires a strong sense of public duty, a good work ethic across society, maybe even a degree of patriotism or social solidarity, all hard things to guarantee.
And if you tax the successful too heavily to pay for it all,
You risk dampening innovation, reducing investment, and potentially shrinking the overall economic pie, which undermines the very resources you need for the social programs. It's a constant balancing act.
Okay, now for something completely different, anarchism. This perspective takes aim at the state itself.
Right. The absolute core belief for anarchists is that society can and should be organized without the state, without its coercive power. Government isn't just flawed. It's seen as intrinsically evil, the primary source of injustice.
And they have a particular view of human nature.
Generally, yes. A very optimistic one. They tend to believe people are naturally good, cooperative, sociable. It's the state, with its laws, hierarchy, and violence, that corrupts people and creates conflict and oppression.
So justice means getting rid of the state.
Fundamentally, abolish government, or at least drastically shrink its power, and natural human goodness and cooperation will flourish. They reject any authority that interferes with spontaneous interaction and voluntary association. Top-down reforms from the state. Worthless, because they reinforce the state's power.
But the source notes anarchism isn't just one single idea.
No, it's quite diverse. Different anarchist thinkers have different reasons for wanting to abolish the state and different visions for what a stateless society might look like.
And it's different from Marxism, even though both might talk about a stateless future.
Key difference. Marxists see the state withering away after a transitional period, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Most anarchists want the state gone now, immediately. They see any state, even a workers' state, as inherently oppressive.
Who are some of the key figures here?
The source mentions William Godwin, an early philosophical anarchist. He argued inequality comes from institutions, remove political rule, and natural rights and reason would guide small, cooperative communities.
P.J. Prunholm, the first to actually call himself an anarchist.
Yes, famous for property as theft, meaning property used to exploit others. He believed society was natural, based on mutual aid. He advocated mutualism, nonprofit cooperation, and opposed violence but wanted the state and exploitative economics gone. Notably, he criticized Marx's dictatorship idea as authoritarian.
Then there's Bakunin, who is more radical.
Mikhail Bakunin, yes. He famously clashed with Marx. Bakunin advocated violent struggle, even terrorism, to bring down the state immediately. He envisioned a future of free federations of independent groups, equal rights for all, right to secede. A major figure in revolutionary anarchism.
Peter Kropotkin offered a different justification.
Right. In mutual aid, he used evolutionary ideas, arguing cooperation is just as important as competition for survival. He believed humans have an instinct for solidarity that would allow society to function justly without state or law. He advocated anarchist communism and also strongly opposed Marx keeping the state after a revolution.
What about George Sorel and anarcho-syndicalism?
Sorel's view is complex. He saw violence everywhere in religion, law, institutions, and argued workers should fight back with violence, specifically the general strike led by trade unions against capitalists and the state. He also talked about using powerful myths or narratives to mobilize people. Because he emphasized organized union power, some question if he's a pure anarchist.
And Tolstoy, the novelist.
Leo Tolstoy, yes, also an influential anarchist thinker. He saw deep corruption in modern society, viewing the state as a tool of oppression for the rich, justice as a sham. He believed the state fights evil with more evil. Police, military. His solution wasn't violence, but individual spiritual regeneration based on faith and honest work, rejecting both the state and private property.
Mahatma Gandhi also fits in here.
His philosophy of nonviolence, satyagraha, led him to critique the state as inherently coercive. His ideal stateless society was based on spontaneous harmony and mutual respect, making state power redundant, a major contribution to the idea of nonviolent anarchism.
And more recently.
The source mentions Murray Bookchin and post-scarcity anarchism. His idea was that modern technology potentially allows us to overcome scarcity, enabling a decentralized society of small, self-sufficient ecological communities living and working together without hierarchy or state control.
Okay, it's a compelling vision in some ways, but the source raises some serious criticisms.
Big challenges, yes. One is the lack of a clear, practical roadmap. How do you actually get from here to a stateless society, especially on a global scale?
And the core opposition to all authority makes organizing difficult.
For pure anarchists, yes. If you reject parties, leaders, any kind of structure, how do you coordinate the massive effort needed to dismantle the state or build alternatives?
The association with violence is also a problem for many.
Definitely. Some anarchist traditions have endorsed terrorism or assassination. The question arises, can you really achieve liberation through acts many see as inhumane?
And what about the modern world? All its complexity.
That's a huge challenge. Dense populations, global economy, resource depletion, pollution, pandemics. These seem to demand more coordination and regulation, not less. The vision of purely spontaneous adjustment feels hard to square with these realities.
The optimistic view of human nature gets questioned, too.
Critics argue it's perhaps naive. Human nature seems mixed, capable of cooperation, yes, but also selfishness and conflict. Institutions, even flawed ones, help manage that. Destroying them all might lead to chaos, not harmony.
So where does the source land on anarchism's relevance?
It suggests its value might not be in the literal immediate abolition of the state, but more in its critical spirit. Its power lies in pushing us to find ways to reduce the need for state coercion, to decentralize power, to challenge concentrations of wealth and dominance, especially private property, and to foster more voluntary cooperation and equitable sharing. It's a constant challenge to existing power structures.
Right. Let's turn now to the feminist perspective on justice. This one has a very specific focus.
Absolutely. It's centered squarely on the historical and ongoing injustices faced by women, demanding their restoration to a position of equal status and opportunity.
The statistics the source cites, even from 1980, are pretty shocking. Women as half the population, doing 2/3 of the work hours, getting 1/10 of the income, owning less than 1/100th of the property. And things haven't radically changed everywhere.
It highlights a massive global disparity. And the core feminist argument is that this isn't natural. It's not because of inherent biological differences in capability. It's a result of social structures, norms, and arrangements that have systematically disadvantaged women.
So tackling injustice against women becomes a central political task.
Yes. The focus is on understanding the causes of this inequality and subordination and finding remedies.
The source gives some historical context.
Noting that early divisions of labor might have made sense biologically, hunting versus child rearing. But as societies developed, men consolidated power in public spheres, while women were largely confined to the private sphere, often deemed the weaker sex,
Given security, perhaps, but denied power.
and systematically excluded from things like owning property, voting, higher education exclusions, often justified by flimsy arguments not really connected to biology.
Early feminists like Mary Wollstonecraft really pushed back against this.
Her vindication of the rights of women was groundbreaking, challenging notions of female inferiority, demanding equal rights based on shared rationality. Her work set the stage for campaigns for education, employment, suffrage. John Stuart Mill, too, in The Subjection of Women, argued powerfully for women's full legal and political equality.
And today, how does the source characterize the current situation?
Well, technology and economic changes have opened more doors, and the principle of equal rights is more widely accepted, at least on paper, in many places.
But there's still debate about what equal rights mean in practice.
Yes, the source outlines two main contemporary views. One is straightforward equality, no essential differences in capability, so the same laws and opportunities should apply equally everywhere.
And the other view?
This one, which the source suggests is more common or maybe more nuanced, acknowledges potential differences, biological, cultural, and argues that equal opportunity should mean giving women the chance to develop their distinctive capabilities alongside having equal basic rights.
So this would allow for things like maternity leave or affirmative action.
Exactly. It could justify special provisions like maternity benefits, maybe different arrangements for child custody, exemptions from certain dangerous jobs. And importantly, it supports affirmative action, things like quotas or reservations in education, politics, or jobs, as necessary measures to actively compensate for past discrimination and ongoing underrepresentation.
The source mentions global efforts to measure this, like the UN's GDI and GM indexes.
Yes, the Gender-Related Development Index and the Gender Empowerment Measure, trying to capture not just if women are healthy and educated, GDI, but also if they have a share in economic and political power, GEM.
And the findings were interesting. Back in the 90s, report cited Scandinavia doing well.
Very well. Near gender parity on those measures then. Many African and Islamic nations scored much lower. India was ranked 99th out of 130 on the GDI at that time.
And crucially, it wasn't just about wealth.
No correlation.
Yeah.
The source highlights poorer countries like Cuba actually scoring relatively high on gender equality measures. It credits socialist models like China and Cuba for using social mobilization to achieve significant progress in women's health, education, and opportunities, even without high national income.
It also noted a potential gap between education, health, and actual power.
Yes, some countries, like the East Asian Tigers back then, might have high GDI, women are educated and healthy, but low GM, they still lack political and economic power, indicating that progress in basic development doesn't automatically translate into dismantling male-dominated power structures.
So the overall feminist demand for justice is twofold.
Secure women's fundamental human development, health, education, and ensure they get a fair and equal share of economic and political power. Justice requires both.
Okay, another important lens, the subaltern perspective. This focuses on groups stuck at the bottom of the social ladder.
Exactly. It's concerned with the plight of groups who are persistently subordinate because of the way society is structured. The exploited, the oppressed, the marginalized, those who don't seem to benefit fairly from the system.
The core issue is this division between rulers and ruled.
Yes, a fundamental split. The ruling class, a minority, manages to secure the vast majority of society's benefits, while the subordinate majority, the subalterns, get a disproportionately small share, even though they often do much of the essential work. The source says this situation poses the question of social justice most eloquently.
And this idea comes from Antonio Gramsci.
The Italian Marxist, yes, writing from prison. He developed the concept of the subaltern to analyze power relations in society. It's explicitly set up as a contrast to traditional elite theory.
How does it differ from elite theory?
Elite theorists like Pareto, Mosca, Michels also saw society divided into elites and masses. But they tended to explain this based on the supposed superior abilities or organizational skills of the elite. The masses get less because, well, they contribute less or are less capable. This often ends up justifying market outcomes to each according to his work, is read as the elite deserve more.
Subaltern theory completely rejects that.
Fundamentally. Gramsci argued the division isn't natural or based on merit. It's artificial and exploitative. Ordinary people, the subalterns, contribute massively, but they're kept down by the ruling class's power structures.
Gramsci's idea of hegemony is important here, right?
Crucial. Hegemony is how the ruling class maintains control not just by force, but by getting its own values and worldview accepted as common sense by everyone, including the subalterns. They rule with consent because the subordinate classes come to see the existing order as natural or even beneficial, even when it exploits them.
So elite theory sees the division as functional, subaltern theory sees it as exploitative.
Precisely. And another key difference. Elite theory often downplays the role of the masses in history, while subaltern theory insists that subordinate groups are historical actors, capable of organizing, resisting, and changing things. It calls for rewriting history from the perspective of the oppressed, not just the rulers.
And the idea of subaltern has broadened beyond just class.
Significantly. Today, it's used to refer to any group that faces systematic, undeserved discrimination and is pushed to the margins.
So based on gender, race, caste, religion, region.
Any category used to justify treating a group as lesser, exploiting their labor or skills, denying them due reward, and undermining their dignity simply because they belong to that group.
So what does justice look like from this perspective?
It means actively protecting the rights of these marginalized subaltern groups. It means ensuring their contributions are properly valued and rewarded. It means restoring their dignity. Fundamentally, it demands a more equitable sharing of society's benefits between the historically dominant and the historically subordinate groups, recognizing the systemic nature of the injustice.
Right, that makes sense. Finally, let's tackle the communitarian perspective. This one is often defined by its critique of liberalism, especially Rawlsian liberalism.
That's often the easiest way in, yes. They start by challenging core liberal assumptions about the individual and society.
What's the main contrast?
Well, liberalism, particularly the kind communitarians critique, tends to see the individual as primary. The isolated self, choosing their own goals, with rights that exist prior to any community ties. Community itself, nationality, culture, tradition, doesn't have independent moral value. It's just a collection of individuals. The common good is just the sum of individual goods. Liberals prioritize the right universal principles of justice over any specific vision of the good life.
And communitarians flip that.
They argue the community is primary, or at least co-equal. Individuals aren't isolated atoms. Our identity, our values, our very ability to make meaningful choices are shaded by the communities we're a part of. We are situated selves, embedded selves. Self-fulfillment comes through participating in shared practices and accepting social roles within the community. The common good isn't just a sum. It's a shared understanding that shapes individual good. And the right only makes sense in the context of a community's shared understanding of the good.
Alasdair MacIntyre is a key figure here.
Very much so. In books like After Virtue, he strongly criticized liberal individualism. He mocked the idea of the autonomous moral agent making choices in a vacuum. He argued we only develop virtues and flourish by participating in established social practices that have their own standards of excellence, usually embedded in a specific tradition or community. He initially saw liberalism as leading to moral chaos, unable to defend any robust account of justice or the common good.
His solution was to turn back to tradition.
Initially, yes, immerse ourselves in the knowledge and traditions of our culture. He often focused on Western culture, to find the resources for moral reasoning. But the source notes he later softened this, acknowledging the dangers of being too tied to tradition and recognizing the value of liberal tolerance.
Michael Sandel is another major communitarian voice, known for targeting Rawls directly.
Yes, in Liberalism and the Limits of Justice. He famously attacked Rawls' unencumbered self, behind the veil of ignorance, as being completely detached, disembodied, lacking any real identity or commitments. Sandel asks, if you strip away all our ties and values, is anything left? He finds the Rawlsian person deeply impoverished.
Sandel stresses our embeddedness.
Exactly. We are embedded in time, place, culture, relationships. Political theory, for Sandel, shouldn't try to extract away from that. It should aim to create laws and institutions that foster a genuinely good common life based on shared self-understandings and mutual concern, not just arrangements between isolated individuals maximizing their own advantage.
He challenges the liberal idea that the self is prior to its ends.
Right. Liberals often think we choose our goals freely, independently of who we are. Sandel argues our ends, our goals, and commitments actually constitute who we are, and we discover these ends through our involvement in shared community life. He thinks the unencumbered self idea fails to capture our deepest sense of self and has even harmed democratic life by weakening ties of community.
Charles Taylor adds to this critique.
Taylor critiques what he calls atomistic individualism in liberal thought. the tendency to see humans just as individual wills, ignoring how our complex personalities and capacities, like agency and freedom, develop only within a social context.
So rights and freedom only make sense within society.
For Taylor, yes. He thinks modern liberalism fails to grasp the reciprocal relationship, how society shapes individuals, and how individuals, as embodied agents engaged in self-interpretation, can then critically reflect on and shape their society's values and practices, drawing on various moral sources.
And then there's Michael Walzer with a slightly different take.
Walzer offers a communitarian theory, but with more pluralist elements. His big idea in spheres of justice is that the search for one single universal principle of justice is misguided. Justice, he argues, has different meanings in different communities, based on their shared understandings of different social goods.
Different goods, different rules.
Exactly. He talks about complex equality. It's not about making everyone equal in everything, simple equality, which he thinks leads to tyranny. It's about recognizing that society has different spheres of life. The market, politics, family, education, healthcare, etc., each with its own distinct goods and its own appropriate principle for distributing those goods.
So money might be the appropriate principle in the market sphere.
But it shouldn't dominate the political sphere, where citizenship or merit might rule, or the family sphere, where love and need should rule. Justice means respecting the boundaries between these spheres.
What's the goal of respecting these boundaries?
Walzer believes if we keep the spheres separate, then being successful in one sphere, say making lots of money, won't automatically translate into dominance in all other spheres, like buying political influence or better healthcare. It leads to a complex equality where no one decisively outranks anyone else across the board because different people will excel according to the different criteria of different spheres.
But the source raises a practical issue here.
Yeah, it's hard to compare the value of goods across spheres. How much social esteem for an artist equals how much income for a banker? It makes it difficult to use Walzer's theory to directly challenge purely economic inequalities if money is seen as belonging properly to the market sphere.
Walzer prioritizes the community's shared understanding.
Yes, he believes the right reason for distributing goods in each sphere is implicit in the community's shared values and history. His principle is essentially, your standing in one sphere shouldn't be determined by your standing in another sphere, contrary to the specific meaning of the goods involved in each sphere. Money shouldn't buy political office, family connections shouldn't determine jobs based on merit.
The source sees this as strong morally, but maybe weak politically.
Strong is a moral philosophy describing how things should work based on shared understandings, but weaker on the political side. How do you actually convince powerful people who benefit from spheres overlapping, like the wealthy influencing politics, to respect those boundaries? It doesn't offer a clear mechanism for enforcement against vested interests.
Wow, okay. We have covered an immense amount of ground. A real deep dive into justice. From liberalism and libertarianism focusing on rights, to Marxism and subaltern theory critiquing systemic exploitation, communitarianism emphasizing community, feminism highlighting gender injustice, anarchism rejecting the state, and democratic socialism seeking a middle path.
It really does show just how incredibly complex this whole question of what is justice truly is. There's clearly no single, simple answer that satisfies everyone.
Because each perspective starts from different places, values different things.
Liberty, equality, community well-being, freedom from exploitation, addressing specific group needs, challenging power itself, the role of the state. They prioritize differently.
And understanding these different lenses, these different priorities, that's incredibly useful, isn't it? It gives you, the listener, a toolkit.
Exactly. A framework for making sense of the justice debates you encounter every day in the news, in policy arguments in your own community, maybe even in your own life.
You can start to see why people disagree. What fundamental assumptions and values are clashing beneath the surface?
It helps you move beyond just seeing arguments as noise and understand the deep philosophical currents driving them.
So let's leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've discussed. If it seems like each of these perspectives, liberalism, Marxism, feminism, communitarianism, and all the others, capture some important truth about justice, some piece of the puzzle.
Can any single one of them, on its own, really give us the whole picture?
Or is the pursuit of justice always going to involve this difficult balancing act, trying to incorporate insights from multiple viewpoints, navigating the tensions and contradictions between them, striving for a more complex, maybe less tidy understanding of fairness? What does your understanding of justice prioritize most highly, and why?